I'm J.J. Smith, and when I was 10 years old, I witnessed my abusive father shoot and kill my mother and then commit suicide. I was one of the lucky ones. I had older brothers and sisters who made sure I was able to go to a psychologist for about a year. That was a good experience. Even back then, I knew that I was what we might call at risk today. And he really helped me a great deal. Not so much by what he said, but after about a year, I'll never forget that he said, "This is going to be our last time together." And I asked him why. I liked him. He was very nice. And he said, "God has blessed you with a very strong will to live, and you're going to be okay." And that was very important to me because I didn't know, honestly, if I was going to be okay. That year, after the death of my parents, was a very lonely year. I was very confused. Fortunately, I did have 4 brothers and sisters that were very loving and very kind and helpful. But I knew that there were going to be some challenges ahead. After that experience, I remember having fear all of my life. In fact, for 35 years, I figured this out the other night, for 35 years I felt fear inside of me. I didn't understand it. I couldn't really put my finger on it. I didn't even know why I felt it. After a few years I went to another counselor because I could tell some things were still amiss in my life, and then I began to realize that it was this fear of my father constantly chasing us. My mother my mother left him. She took me and left him from Los Angeles. We went to Florida to escape, get away from him and his abuse. And then he caught up with us. I have occasionally gone back. It's still very vivid in my memory as a 10-year-old, watching my father break into our apartment, our small apartment. He told my mother to sit down. She said, "No, I'm getting out." He told her to sit down again. She said, "No, I'm getting out." And she headed for the door, and that's when he pulled the trigger. And I know that he was there to do harm. There was no other reason to be there. So as I've rehearsed this in my mind many times, either speaking out loud to a counselor or just to myself or to a friend, that's essential to do that. You've got to work through this. A child has to work through it. And if I was speaking to myself, if I was talking to my 10-year-old self right now, I'd say, you have to think this through. You have to try to grip some sort of reality. You have to get some meaning out of this. I finally came to the conclusion, and I didn't know this when I was young, but I finally learned a few years later that, well, probably several years later, that my father was a casualty of World War II. He was a tank commander, and his tank was blown up, and he was full of shrapnel. And he came back from World War II suffering from what we now call post-traumatic stress syndrome. Well, initially, I was very angry with my father for doing what he did. However, after I began to realize there was a reason for this, and I constantly asked myself as a teenager, why would my dad do this? Finally, I began to realize he did it because he had, I guess we might say, gone crazy as a result of the war. And you know, no matter who the abuser is, there's a reason why they do what they do. And we often hear it's because they want to control someone. A man might want to control a woman or vice versa. But what's the reason they want to control them? And I've concluded, from my personal experience as well as from research, that it's 2 or 3 things. First of all, the abuser has either been abandoned by his parents in life, or at least feels abandoned, or he's been seriously neglected or seriously abused. And as a result of those actions, children and adults build up a tremendous amount of not only fear of abandonment again, and fear of having to go through what they've gone through as a child, but a tremendous amount of anger, and I think it's better called rage. I had rage inside of me, and it didn't come out until I was a parent of actually 8 children. We called it organized chaos, but there were times that I just was full of rage and wanted to control things. So I did go to counseling, again, when I was, I don't know, 50 years old. So many years after this experience took place. And fortunately, this wonderful counselor asked me, have you ever said goodbye to your parents? And I said, goodbye to my parents? How do I do that? I mean, that was 40 years ago. And I remember visualizing them. I asked him, well, how do I do this? And he said, just picture your mom and your dad walking away, and you're waving to them, and wave to them. And so I did, and I saw them, and I can still see the picture. They were going over a hill down into a sunset, and I was saying goodbye to them. And they didn't really say goodbye to me. They just, were walking on. But I was able to say goodbye to them. And that was such a refreshing experience. It was like you finished reading a book, and then you closed the cover. And another counselor that I met with years ago told me that that's a problem I was struggling with at that point in my life. Excuse me. I had finished the book, but I had not yet closed the book. I had not yet closed the cover. And he said, you need to do that. And I thought that sounds so silly. But I decided to do it. So I went home that evening and I closed the book. I literally, in my mind, and literally closed the book. And when I did that, it was so cleansing and so helpful.